A machine broke down. The CEO scoffed, then pointed at the quiet farm kid in the corner. Let him try. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was who the boy's father really was, and what he had taught him. What happened next wasn't just a repair, it was a revelation. Watch until the end. This story proves legacy runs deeper than blood. Stick around. This story will change the way you see ordinary people forever. Before we begin, if stories of quiet courage, unexpected love, and everyday miracles speak to your heart, consider subscribing. One click helps us bring more of these true-to-life inspirations into the world, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Now, let's begin. The wind cut sharp across the plains that morning, slipping through the steel girders and rusted siding of Tucker Steelworks like it was searching for something lost. Inside the plant, the air felt heavier than it had in years, not from heat or smoke, but from the weight of silence. What had once been a proud monument to American manufacturing now sat in nervous stillness, its heart, the new $7.2 million press line, utterly still. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the truth had settled in the bones of the building. They were out of answers. A week and a half had passed since the system crashed, and despite the best minds and the biggest paychecks, the machine hadn't so much as blinked. The hum that once powered daily production had been replaced by a thick, unsettling quiet. Engineers paced like ghosts. Management sent emails they didn't expect responses to. Even the floor supervisors had stopped pretending there was a plan. In the far corner of the main hall, away from the flickering red diagnostic monitors and hushed arguments, a teenage boy sat quietly on a flipped-over crate. Jalen Carter, 14, mud-stained boots still crusted from last night's storm, kept his head down and his pencil moving. His jacket, handed down twice over, hung off his narrow frame. The battered notebook in his lap had smudges of graphite and engine grease across nearly every page. He didn't belong here, not officially. He came along every morning with his mother, Regina, who worked the overnight janitorial shift. She'd asked him to stay in the break room, but he never did. Instead, he drifted to the edge of the shop floor just before the morning crew arrived and watched. Watched how the engineers tapped their keyboards. Watched how they stared at schematics they no longer believed in. Watched the broken press line like it was some ancient puzzle waiting to be solved. Most people didn't notice the kid, and if they did, they never looked twice. Just a farm boy with a mop for a shadow. That morning, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Word had spread like wildfire. Bryce Langford was flying in. The CEO of Tucker Steelworks didn't visit unless something was on fire, and this time, the blaze was metaphorical, but just as destructive. Orders were backing up. Clients were pulling contracts. 2 regional distributors had already threatened legal action. The press line was supposed to revolutionize production. Instead, it had brought everything to a grinding halt. The first sign of Langford's arrival was the low growl of a black Escalade, rolling into the front lot. No one needed to be told who it was. Everyone on shift had seen the man's photo in company emails. Crisp suit, hard jaw, the kind of executive who smiled with one side of his mouth, if he smiled at all. He stepped out of the SUV with the kind of practiced authority that came from knowing you could ruin a man's livelihood with a signature. Behind him, 2 assistants followed like satellites, one already speaking into a Bluetooth headset while the other reviewed data on a tablet. Langford walked like the floor belonged to him. Inside, staff gathered near the downed machine, drawn by rumor, dread, and the kind of dark curiosity reserved for plane crashes and corporate showdowns. Engineers stood stiffly near their stations. Mid-level managers adopted the look of people trying to blend into the wall. Langford didn't stop to shake hands or ask questions. He walked straight to the dead press line and stared at it like it had personally insulted him. The steel beast, once so sleek and advanced, now seemed like a failed experiment. The glowing red fault lights were a slap in the face. He spoke without raising his voice, but the words cut through the room like broken glass. 10 days, he said. 10 days of excuses. I've had engineering teams from Boston to San Jose look at this thing. We've burned through hundreds of hours, tens of thousands of dollars, and it's still dead. Silence. He glanced toward Greg, the lead systems engineer, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. I was told this machine would increase output by 40%, Langford continued, pacing in slow, deliberate steps. Instead, we've got customers threatening breach of contract and a press line that's basically an expensive statue." Still, no one responded. The only sound was the quiet, steady dripping of a leaking pipe in the corner. Langford turned toward the crowd and let the silence stretch for a beat too long. Then came the smirk, that cruel corporate smirk that always preceded a punchline. "Maybe we're going about this all wrong," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe we should let the janitor's kid take a crack at it." There was a beat of stunned silence, followed by awkward laughter, nervous, sharp, forced. Jalen heard it all, the jab, the chuckles, the murmurs that always followed moments like these. He didn't move at first. His fingers kept tapping the edge of the notebook, but something in the air shifted around him. He stood. Regina, wiping down a stainless steel sink on the far side of the break area, looked up just in time to see her son step off the crate. Her heart dropped. Jalen walked steadily toward the machine, the crowd parting around him like he wasn't supposed to exist in their world. Langford's head tilted slightly as he noticed the movement. "Something I can help you with, son?" the CEO asked. "I'd like to try," Jalen said. There was no shake in his voice, no teenage wobble, just certainty. Langford blinked, then laughed, softly, mockingly. "You're serious?" "Yes." The CEO turned to the engineers, most of whom were too stunned to respond. A few were already pulling out phones. Some smirks returned. "This should be good," someone whispered. Langford made a grand gesture. "Be my guest." Jalen didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He walked straight to the side panel and crouched beside it. He'd memorized its layout from the dozens of times he'd watched them run diagnostics. He knew the fuse points, the wiring diagram, the power feed channels. From his jacket, he pulled a scratched-up multi-tool. Nothing fancy, but reliable. The tool his father gave him before he disappeared from the engineering world without warning. He opened the panel. People leaned in, some curious, some amused. Behind the crowd, Ernie Velasquez narrowed his eyes. There was something about the way the kid moved, something familiar in the way he didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. He watched the boy's hands trace over the relays, pause, adjust, and move on with quiet purpose. Jalen mumbled to himself, almost inaudible. Something about an inverter. Something about a shorted sensor misreading the load. The words didn't matter to most, but to Ernie, they rang with eerie precision. Without ceremony, Jalen twisted two connectors, gently pinched a reset relay, then stepped back. "You can try it now," he said. Langford raised an eyebrow. Claire Monroe, head of systems, gave a skeptical look, but nodded to the operator. The button was pressed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hum returned. Not a weak stutter, but a full, deep, confident rhythm. Lights flickered green. The feed belt rolled forward. Pneumatic arms extended. Hydraulic valves hissed into position. The machine was alive. Gasps followed, then stunned silence. Phones stopped recording. People blinked as if unsure whether what they saw was real. Langford's jaw tightened. He turned back toward the boy. "How did you know how to do that?" Jalen glanced up. "My dad taught me." Ernie Velasquez stiffened. For a second, it was like he was looking through time. "Jeremiah Carter," he whispered to no one. Regina didn't speak. She just stood frozen, eyes locked on her son, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. The factory buzzed with whispers. Langford adjusted his cuff, expression unreadable, but the press line kept running, smooth as glass. And in that moment, no one could pretend the kid was just the janitor's son. For a few seconds after the press line roared back to life, no one knew how to respond. The room was frozen, not in awe, not yet, but in that stunned quiet that follows something impossible happening right in front of you. A 14-year-old kid had just revived the most expensive piece of machinery in the plant, and the first reaction from most of the staff was confusion. Surely it was a fluke, a coincidence, a 1 in a million guess, right? But the machine didn't falter. It purred. The green indicators blinked in rhythm. The feed belt rotated like it had never stopped. Pneumatics sighed and clicked into sync. The hum of life was unmistakable. Phones that had once been lifted to mock were still recording. but now the hands holding them were shaking slightly. Jalen stepped back from the panel, face calm but unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't look around for praise. Bryce Langford, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as still. His jaw tightened. The corners of his mouth twitched with something between forced amusement and buried rage. He gave a slow, mocking clap, just 3 soft smacks of his palms that echoed more than they should have. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole room, "I guess even a broken clock's right twice a day." The engineers chuckled weakly, not because it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do. Nobody dared be the first to challenge Bryce Langford's narrative. Jalen didn't flinch. Langford turned toward the others, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Looks like our new junior technician has some magic fingers. What do you say, folks? Want to give him a toolbox and a badge?" The room remained quiet. "Come on," Langford pushed. "Kid plugs in a wire and now he's the second coming of Edison." Jalen, still standing near the press line, turned slightly, just enough to face the control board again. There was no anger in his posture, just curiosity. The system was running, but something about the display caught his eye. The temperature readouts were uneven. Timing sensors were operating, but one of them was lagging by milliseconds. He frowned. Langford's mocking tone didn't stop. "Tell you what, Jalen, you've already won today's entertainment award. Want to take another swing while you've still got the spotlight?" There was no expectation of a real answer, but Jalen stepped forward again. His mother, Regina, stood on the far side of the factory floor, hands frozen on the handle of her mop. She looked pale, like someone watching her child walk out onto a battlefield. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Jalen knelt down near the power relay junction beneath the control panel, a section no one had touched in days, mostly because they'd ruled it out early on. Engineers had assumed the surge that crashed the system came from software conflicts. The physical checks had been rushed, but Jalen hadn't made that assumption. He ran his fingers along the outer casing, then popped the panel open again. He stared for a long moment, then squinted closer. The wiring harness had a slight pinch near the bottom, a tight bend that didn't match the factory spec. It looked subtle, but to trained eyes, or at least to someone who paid attention, it stood out like a red flag in a snowstorm. He reached for his multi-tool. "Still going, huh?" Langford said. "Let's hope you don't burn the whole place down." More laughs. Fewer this time. Ernie Velasquez didn't laugh. He'd moved to the edge of the group, arms crossed, one hand gripping his chin. The way Jalen moved, it wasn't the fumbling of a lucky guess. It wasn't the awkward poking of a curious kid. It was practiced, precise, familiar. Ernie had seen that kind of confidence before, years ago. The boy adjusted the clamp on the wire, then gently unseated a terminal. As he pulled it back, a small spark jumped. Not enough to do damage, but enough to tell him the wire had been arcing intermittently. He pulled a flashlight from his coat pocket and leaned in closer. The insulation around the connector had worn thin, not enough to be obvious, but enough to disrupt signals under load. A minor flaw. A flaw that, over time, could cause ripple failures in adjacent sensors. A flaw no one had found, not in 10 days. Jalen looked up at the machine, then toward the diagnostic screen. The lagging sensor, Zone 3 temperature, was now reading in sync. He pulled back, reseated the panel, and stood. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The readouts on the main screen stabilized. No warning lights, no drift, no hiccup in cycle timing. For the first time in 10 days, the press line wasn't just alive, it was balanced. Langford frowned. Claire Monroe, the lead systems engineer, took a cautious step forward, brow furrowed. She examined the data stream on her tablet and slowly looked over her glasses. "Whatever he just did," she said quietly, "it worked." Langford didn't respond. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Jalen stepped away from the machine and returned to the edge of the crowd. He didn't look for approval. He didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize. He simply slipped the multi-tool back into his pocket and glanced toward his mother, who still hadn't moved. Ernie Velasquez finally broke the silence. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's Jeremiah Carter's walk." The words weren't meant for anyone but himself, yet they cut through the tension like a blade. Some of the older staff turned at the name. A few of them blinked, the recognition slow, buried under years of faded memory. But Ernie wasn't guessing. He knew what he was seeing. The posture, the tools, the way Jalen had diagnosed a phantom fault using nothing but instinct and eyes older than his years. Jeremiah had done the same thing in that very building 2 decades earlier. Langford glanced sideways. Who? Ernie didn't answer. Not yet. The CEO turned his attention back to the press line, the evidence of his own failure humming at full power behind him. His plan, to mock the kid, crush the morale, assert dominance, had just backfired. Now, there was a camera roll full of footage showing a teenager doing what 24 engineers couldn't. And worse, people were starting to believe in it. In the corner, Jalen sat back down on the same overturned crate. He reopened his notebook and started to sketch. No showboating, no grandstanding. Just pencil to paper, recording the layout of the relay circuit he'd just fixed. To him, the spotlight was unnecessary. The machine was the only thing that mattered. To Langford, however, that calm focus was an act of defiance. And to Ernie Velasquez, it was something else entirely. It was a memory returning to life. It wasn't just the press line that had shut down. It was the entire plant's rhythm. The unshakable beat of machines that usually filled the air with purpose had been replaced with a strange, paralyzing stillness. Nobody wanted to move too quickly, say the wrong thing, or be caught looking impressed. Because if what they just saw was real, if that kid actually fixed the heart of Tucker Steelworks, then everything they thought they knew about power, skill, and status had just been turned on its head. Jalen hadn't even looked up. He'd returned to his crate, pulled out his notebook, and kept sketching. Just another morning with graphite under his nails and machine logic spinning in his head. But the press line now ran smoother than it had in weeks. Indicators blinked green in perfect sequence. Mechanical arms retracted and extended with the exact timing intended by their designers. The stubborn fault codes that had haunted every shift leader were gone, buried under one teenager's quiet, methodical correction. That's when the voices began to surface. At first, it was whispers. Fluke. Lucky guess. He probably shorted something and reset the system by accident. Then it got nastier. He's just a farmer's brat. Looks like a damn scarecrow with a screwdriver. Let's see him do it again, in front of all of us. The engineers who had been secretly recording now kept their phones close, not to share a triumph, but to capture what they assumed would be the boys' crash back to Earth. One successful fix didn't mean anything, at least not in their world. The pressure had only just begun. Bryce Langford stood to the side, arms folded across his chest. His smirk was back, but it had sharpened into something darker, not amused anymore, irritated, exposed. He couldn't let the boys' fix become legend. He needed to reassert control, and quickly. He called across the floor, voice loud enough to echo off the beams. If you're really that good, how about we make it interesting? The crowd turned. Phones rose again. Regina froze behind her cart, already sensing the direction of this performance. Jalen slowly looked up. Langford stepped forward, his tone casually cruel. You say you know this machine, right? Then fix what no one's been able to touch. He gestured toward a secondary control hub, a tightly wound cabinet at the base of the press line. That section, marked in red, had been labeled offline, do not engage, since the first week of the failure. It had been tied to the cascading faults that crippled production in the first place. Every engineer had poked at it, logged dozens of hours trying to get it to respond, but the diagnostics looped endlessly. Some believed the board inside had been fried. Others thought it was a software glitch that corrupted the relay hierarchy. No one knew for sure. Langford tapped the steel casing once. You bring this back, he said, eyes narrowing, and I'll believe you're not just a kid with a lucky hand. The room went completely still. Then he added, casually, like a man tossing out the weather. And if it doesn't work, your mom's out of a job. The weight of the words hung there, too sharp, too deliberate. It wasn't a joke. It was a calculated threat, made to remind everyone where the real power still lived. A silence followed that was more than awkward. It was suffocating. Jalen didn't flinch. He set his notebook down, stood, and walked toward the unit. Regina started moving from across the room, but Ernie Velasquez stepped in gently, placing a firm hand on her arm. Let him do it, he said, barely above a whisper. He's not just guessing. Jalen knelt in front of the red-marked cabinet. Around him, the engineers gathered again, a little closer this time. Some wore smirks, others the same detached skepticism they reserved for first-year interns. Quiet bets were made, slipped between colleagues like poker chips. 1 minute tops before he blows the circuit. He shorts that thing and HR's writing paperwork all afternoon. Get ready for fireworks. But Jalen was focused. The cabinet's surface was cool to the touch. He unscrewed the front panel slowly, careful not to trigger the tamper alarm. Inside was a nest of colored wires and a central board, some connections with labels half peeled from heat stress. He noticed right away that the power regulation module had been bypassed, manually rerouted through a redundant loop that, on paper, should have worked. In practice, it created a feedback delay. He checked the voltage readout from the side fuse and confirmed the fault. No one had seen it, because no one had listened to the timing difference between cycles. He made one adjustment, then another. He checked grounding terminals, reseated a thermal sensor, and rewired a relay in the correct polarity. Finally, he reached back into his jacket for the same multi-tool. His hands were steady, even as he felt dozens of eyes locked on every move. Behind him, the hush was almost reverent. Almost. Langford's voice cut through. Clock's ticking, Carter. The last wire clicked into place. Jalen closed the panel. Claire Monroe, standing with arms crossed and eyes skeptical but now curious, raised a hand to the operator. Bring it online. The air held its breath. A screen blinked. For half a second, nothing happened. Then a high-pitched tone chirped through the plant. System confirmation. Green lights fired in rapid succession. The board glowed like a Christmas tree in perfect sequence. The secondary hub buzzed to life, feeding directly into the main line. The diagnostic screen showed 0 fault codes. Voltage stabilized. The system resynced itself to the line's master controller. It was perfect. The plant didn't erupt. It froze. Because what they saw wasn't luck. It wasn't even just a miracle. It was mastery. The only sound came from the press line itself as it completed a full cycle. Clean, precise, every movement in lockstep. Langford's face was stone. Jalen stepped back, said nothing, and walked toward the crate where his notebook still waited. No arrogance, no apology, just a quiet return to his seat. And in that moment, everyone in the factory knew they'd just witnessed something they didn't have a name for. Yet. The line kept running. The factory stood still. The moment the final green light flicked on, and the press line completed its first flawless cycle in nearly 2 weeks, a strange wave washed through the factory floor. One that didn't come with a cheer, or even applause. It came with disbelief. The kind of disbelief that makes grown men forget to blink. The hum of the machine was steady, measured, a perfect heartbeat. Some clapped, almost involuntarily, light, polite, cautious. But just as many stood still, their faces tight, expressions unreadable. The silence that followed wasn't just stunned, it was loaded, weighted with ego, confusion, and, for some, fear. Because if what they just saw was real, then the balance of competence inside Tucker Steelworks had just shifted, violently. Bryce Langford's jaw moved side to side. His shoulders rose once, then fell in a long, measured breath as he tried to reset the temperature of the moment. He was a man used to owning the room, controlling the spin. But this was a story he hadn't written, and worse, it had unfolded in front of a dozen recording phones and half the staff. He stepped forward slowly, hands clasped behind his back, and studied Jalen like a school principal dissecting a student's prank. His tone, when he finally spoke, was coated in sarcasm, thinly disguised as curiosity. Well, now, isn't that something? No one responded. Bryce's eyes narrowed. You want to tell me how a kid, who doesn't even have a work badge, just fixed a system our entire engineering team has been chasing in circles for 10 days? Jalen didn't answer right away. He reached for his notebook on the crate, flipped it shut, and stood without rushing. His face was calm, but a flush had crept into his ears. Not from fear, but from the weight of so many eyes. Bryce took a step closer. I asked you a question, son. I paid attention, Jalen replied simply. A few heads turned. Claire Monroe, still holding her tablet, arched one eyebrow. Bryce wasn't satisfied. His voice rose, not quite angry yet, but clearly trying to reestablish dominance. Don't play smart. You didn't pay attention your way into realigning voltage inputs and identifying a false positive in a sensor loop. That takes training. That takes years. Jalen looked down at his boots for a second, then up again. His voice, when it came, was quiet, barely above a whisper. My dad taught me. The words hung there. Regina, standing against the wall behind the crowd, slowly closed her eyes. It was the kind of sentence no one expected to carry weight, but it did, especially to Ernie Velasquez, who'd been watching the boys' every move like a man chasing a ghost. His jaw tightened. The name had been rolling around the back of his mind for an hour now, tickling something buried in the past. And now it was starting to take shape. Bryce stared at Jalen with a strange kind of pause. Not recognition, not yet, but something close. The word dad had stirred a memory, faint, fuzzy, but real. What's your father's name? Bryce asked, almost too casually. Jalen hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't sure he was supposed to say. Behind him, his mother's voice cracked through the tension, sharp and quiet. Jalen. He turned, met her eyes. She gave the slightest shake of her head, a silent plea, but he said it anyway. Jeremiah Carter. Claire Monroe looked up from her screen like she'd just heard a name in a dream she forgot she had. Her fingers hovered above her tablet for a second, before slowly starting to type. Bryce blinked. He didn't react with shock, not visibly, but something behind his eyes shifted, something subtle and buried. I don't know that name, he lied too quickly. Ernie Velasquez nearly scoffed. Claire was already swiping through a private archive. She didn't say anything, not yet, but her face tightened. She wasn't the kind of woman who let a detail slip, and the name Jeremiah Carter wasn't one you heard every day. It clicked somewhere in her memory. She just needed to find where. Langford cleared his throat and turned away from Jalen, as if the interaction were already beneath him. Well, he said, adjusting his cuffs, if this is what we're relying on now, I suppose we should draft a policy for teenage apprentices. There were forced chuckles from a few nearby managers, the kind of laughter that comes from people who don't want to be seen not laughing. But Jalen was no longer listening. He'd said the name, and the air felt different now. Ernie moved through the crowd, slow but deliberate. He stopped just beside Jalen and looked at him, really looked. His weathered face was unreadable, but his eyes held a weight that didn't waver. You ever see the inside of a Series 4 relay when it shorts? He asked quietly. Jalen nodded once. If it's not shielded right, it melts the connector housing. Ernie just stared at him for a second more, then gave a soft grunt, not quite approval, but not disbelief either. Behind them, Claire had walked to a corner of the floor, her back turned, typing rapidly on her tablet. She was in the internal engineering database now, scrolling through names, patents, technician logs from the early years of Tucker Steelworks. And then she found it. Jeremiah T. Carter, Systems Lead, 2003 to 2009, contributor to the prototype hydraulic sequencing module for early press models, filed a patent for modular redundancy bypass that was never implemented, disappeared after a lab fire incident, marked as resigned voluntarily. She stared at the screen for a long time. Something wasn't right. She tapped her comm and walked briskly toward her office without saying a word. Meanwhile, Bryce Langford was already in motion, whispering to one of his assistants, expression dark. The power had shifted, and he could feel it. He didn't like it. Jalen sat back down. Regina hadn't moved. The factory hadn't quite accepted what it had witnessed, not yet. But the first echoes of the truth were there, whispering, rumbling. The name Carter had landed, and it wasn't going away. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread. By the time the second shift clocked in and caught wind of the morning's events, the story had already morphed into something larger than life. A kid had fixed the $1 million press line. The machine had been dead for weeks. Executives had flown in experts from both coasts, but none of them, not a single credentialed engineer, had managed to bring it back online. And then a janitor's kid walked in, touched the thing, and it came roaring back like it had just been factory tuned. Who is he? Where'd he learn that? Did you see Langford's face? I heard the kid's name is Carter, like Jeremiah Carter. The last sentence carried more weight than the others, because among the older crew, those who'd been around during the early expansion of Tucker Steelworks, that name wasn't just a coincidence. It was a memory, a ghost, a name that had once lived in the blueprints, and suddenly, it was alive again. By noon, the factory buzzed with the kind of tension usually reserved for corporate shakeups or safety investigations. Every hallway conversation was about the kid, Jalen Carter. Word traveled fast in a place like Tucker, where rumors were currency and speculation was a contact sport. Some said the fix was a fluke. Others swore they saw the boy work the control board like he'd built it himself. A few whispered that Bryce Langford had gone red in the face. The younger techs were already trading clips of the moment, shaky phone footage capturing Jalen stepping away from the press line just as the screen lit green and the machine kicked into rhythm. In the upper offices, things were far less amused. Langford's face had remained composed as he left the floor, but by the time he slammed the conference room door shut behind him, the mask cracked. His executive team, 4 mid-level VPs and the senior HR lead, stood silent as the CEO tossed his leather folder onto the glass table with a loud slap. "I want control of this story," he barked. He didn't sit, he paced. "I want every phone video tracked and contained. I want our internal channels locked. No social media, no interviews, no backdoor quotes to the press. We shut this down now." The HR lead raised a hand cautiously. "It's already online. One of the contractors posted it. 40,000 views in the last hour." Langford paused. His jaw twitched. "Then flag it. Report it. Have legal draft to take down." Another VP cleared his throat. "It's not just the footage. The story's spreading internally. Everyone's talking about the kid, about his name." Langford turned sharply. "And what name would that be?" There was hesitation. "Carter." Langford didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his tablet, tapped the screen, and brought up the company intranet. A photo of the boy flashed on the security footage stills from earlier that morning. Jalen crouched at the base of the control hub, tool in hand. "Who is he?" he asked coldly. "He's not on payroll," someone mumbled. "I know that," Langford snapped. "I want to know who his parents are. I want to know what he's doing here, and more importantly, I want to know what he thinks he's doing with my press line." No one in the room answered, but in the silence, something far more dangerous was growing. Doubt. Meanwhile, down on the factory floor, Regina Carter had cornered her son near the staff locker bay. She was angry, but not in the way that shows on the surface. Her words were quiet, urgent, tense like a violin string pulled too tight. "You can't keep doing this," she said. "You don't understand what you've just walked into." Jalen stood tall for someone his age, but in front of his mother, he still looked like a boy. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You exposed yourself. You exposed us." He frowned. "I didn't say anything they didn't already know." "Yes, you did," she said. "You said your father's name. You don't know what that means in this place." "I know enough." She stepped closer. Her voice dropped. "You know what happened to him?" Jalen paused. "You never told me." "And I had a reason." Before she could say more, a familiar voice called out from behind them. "You should listen to your mother, kid." It was Ernie Velasquez, arms crossed, watching them both with a look that was less judgment and more concern. There was something unspoken in his eyes, something that said he knew exactly what they were both carrying. "People around here don't like being shown up," he said, quieter now, "especially by someone without a name badge, and especially if that name is Carter." Jalen didn't look away. "He was one of you, wasn't he?" Ernie exhaled through his nose. "He was more than that." Then, without another word, he turned and walked off down the hall, leaving Regina and Jalen standing there in a silence too heavy to break. Upstairs, Claire Monroe sat in her office, eyes locked on the patent database. Her screen displayed a faded document, archived, black and white, but still clear. Patent ID US-5 883497-JT. Title: Modular Redundancy Bypass for Multiload. Hydraulic Press Systems, filed by Jeremiah T. Carter, Systems Engineering Lead, Tucker Steelworks, 2007. She leaned back slowly in her chair, arms folded, a single eyebrow raised. The document included schematic blueprints. They looked familiar, too familiar, because the exact logic pathways Jeremiah had laid out in those early designs matched what Jalen had done that morning, down to the relay configuration. She tapped her pen against her desk, thoughts racing. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a prodigy guessing his way through industrial engineering. This was a blueprint coming to life. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then set it back down. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a fluke, bigger than a viral moment. It was a story long buried by smoke, silence, and strategic forgetting. And now, it was surfacing again. The ghosts weren't just in the control room. They were everywhere. Claire Monroe had been in engineering long enough to know when something didn't add up. And right now, everything about Jalen Carter smelled like a cover-up, except it wasn't his doing. It was someone else's silence, someone else's fear. That boy had walked into her factory and solved something she and her entire team had struggled with for days, and he'd done it with the kind of intuition that didn't come from tutorials or dumb luck. It came from legacy, and legacy left a paper trail. That's how Claire found herself walking briskly across the concrete floor of Tucker Steelworks late that afternoon, tablet in hand, heels clicking like a metronome of rising tension. She wasn't heading to HR or the CEO's office. She was headed for the locker corridor, where she'd been told Jalen and Regina were packing up to leave. They were almost at the exit when Claire caught up. "Mrs. Carter," she called out, voice sharp. Regina stopped first. Then Jalen turned slowly, expression neutral. Claire didn't speak right away. She studied both of them, how the mother stood slightly in front of the son, protective by instinct, how the boy looked her straight in the eye without a hint of guilt, like he knew exactly what she was here to ask. "I found a patent," Claire said flatly, "filed by a Jeremiah T. Carter, redundancy bypass system. The schematics, they match what your son used to repair the press line." Regina's jaw tightened. Jalen said nothing. Claire raised her tablet. The blueprint filled the screen, a grainy scan from 2007, but unmistakably similar to the circuit path Jalen had redrawn in his notebook. Where did he learn that configuration? Regina's lips parted, then closed, then opened again, but no words came. Claire's tone softened, just barely. "I'm not here to accuse him of anything, but if what I think is true, then this boy didn't just fix a machine. He revived a system we abandoned, and he did it from memory." Jalen finally spoke. "I didn't memorize it. I studied it. My dad's old notes. Some were burned, some were saved." Claire took a slow breath. She wasn't used to being the one learning something in these conversations. "Why wasn't his name ever brought up in our design logs?" she asked. "Why is his patent buried under an inactive tag, as if it never mattered?" Regina finally stepped in. "Because they made sure it never would." Her voice was cold, controlled. She looked past Claire toward the upper windows of the admin wing, where Bryce Langford's office glowed faintly behind tinted glass. "My husband wasn't the kind of man they could own," Regina continued. "He challenged designs, questioned protocols, made enemies in the wrong rooms, and when the accident happened, they buried him right along with the truth." Claire didn't interrupt. She just stood there, processing every word. "He didn't walk away," Regina said. "He was pushed." Inside the admin wing, Bryce Langford wasn't pacing for once. He was sitting, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowed at his computer screen. His assistant had just delivered a troubling update. Someone from the engineering department had accessed archived patent records tied to early design contributors. The name Carter was showing up too often, and that couldn't be allowed. Langford leaned in and tapped the keys. The patent system interface blinked open. A few strokes later, he'd found the Carter file. He hovered over the status tag. The patent was marked as dormant, a bureaucratic designation that made it effectively invisible to most internal searches. With a few clicks, he prepared a request to archive the entire author history, removing Carter's name from all visible contributions to the Series 4 line. He hit Submit. The screen confirmed, record moved to inactive status, erased, at least for now. Back on the floor, Jalen had wandered from the conversation, his attention drawn by a faint clicking noise coming from the far end of the press line. Something wasn't right. A repetitive tap echoed off the walls, barely noticeable, but definitely out of sync. He followed the sound, stepping past coils of feedstock and a few idle techs who were still whispering about the kid. He stopped in front of an auxiliary feeder. The small conveyor was vibrating slightly, too much for idle status. And the timing chip was running hot. He pulled out his multi-tool, dropped to one knee, and popped the side panel. Claire, noticing him disappear mid-conversation, followed quietly. "What are you doing?" she asked. Jalen didn't look up. "Something's wrong with the sync coil. It's misfiring." She blinked. "That system hasn't been online in days." "I know." Within minutes, he'd rerouted the circuit, replaced the sensor, realigned a coil that had come loose from a worn rubber mount. When he rebooted the feeder, it ran flawlessly. Claire just stared. "That wasn't in your dad's notes," she said. Jalen stood, brushing dust off his jeans. "That one I figured out myself." She smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition. "You're not just his son," she said. "You're his upgrade." From behind them, Ernie Velasquez stepped forward. He'd seen the whole thing from a distance, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You know," he said, "I worked with Jeremiah for 6 years. We built the first core together. He used to do this thing with his thumb, press it into a relay before sealing the panel, said it grounded the energy." He pointed at Jalen's hand. "You do the same thing." Jalen blinked, then glanced at his thumb, grease-stained, calloused, a habit formed from a man he never got to know. Ernie nodded slowly. "There's no doubt," he said. "That kid's his son." The words didn't echo like a revelation. They landed more like a verdict. Proof, once whispered, had now spoken out loud. And nothing at Tucker Steelworks would ever feel quite the same again. The quiet awe that had surrounded Jalen's earlier feats had started turning into something more volatile. Admiration was beginning to clash with authority, and it didn't take long for the pressure to rise to the top of the corporate food chain. Bryce Langford had built his career on control, of systems, of narratives, of people. But control was slipping. Each time that boy solved a problem no one else could, it chipped away at the illusion that Bryce's kingdom ran on anything other than fear and well-manicured appearances. From the privacy of his glass-walled office, Bryce watched the factory floor like a hawk, surveying a field of mutiny. The press line was running smoother than it had in years, and the name Carter was being whispered more frequently than any executive title. That wouldn't do. If he couldn't erase the past, he'd rewrite the present. That afternoon, Bryce gave a directive to his operations team. A staged fault would be introduced into a different sector of the press line, one that had a notoriously convoluted layout and a failure history that even the company's top specialists struggled with. Then he sent out a public notice. There would be a live diagnostic challenge. The guest contributor, as he phrased it, would have 60 minutes to identify and repair the fault. The entire plant was invited to watch. Word spread fast. This wasn't a test. It was a spectacle, a trap in full daylight. Every supervisor and shift lead knew it. The newer techs caught on by lunchtime. Even the cleaning crew started rearranging their breaks to see what would unfold. Phones were being charged, camera angles planned. It wasn't every day the hierarchy exposed itself so brazenly. Jalen heard about the challenge secondhand. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded once and folded the same notebook he'd used before. He understood what this was. And still, he walked toward it. Regina tried to intercept him by the service lockers. Her words were sharp, her presence urgent. She warned him of the consequences, told him he had nothing to prove, that this wasn't about fairness, it was about humiliation, that they would cheer when he failed because it meant their world could go back to normal. Jalen listened, but his mind was already past the fear. He gave her a simple answer, not loud, not for anyone else, just for her. They need to see it. For the first time in years, the heart of Tucker Steelworks pulsed not with the rhythm of machines, but with the sharp, collective intake of breath from hundreds of workers drawn like gravity toward a single moment. The concrete floor beneath them had never felt heavier. Time hung from the rafters, thick as steel dust in the summer heat, while all eyes settled on the boy standing alone before the dead press line. There was no ceremony, no spotlight, just the silent arrival of Jalen Carter, 14, wiry, quiet, carrying a dented backpack and a name that was beginning to echo across the plant with ghost-like intensity. The press substation before him had baffled senior technicians for weeks. Its logic modules were temperamental, its sensors corrupted by time, heat, and overcompensation. No one expected it to run again. Not today, not in front of an audience. And yet, here he stood, the weight of a legacy he barely understood pressing against his shoulders, staring down the uncooperative beast of rusted tech and bureaucratic denial. Overhead, a red LED clock clicked to life. 60:00, a silent signal that the countdown had begun. Phones rose, cameras rolled. Some snickered under their breath, others whispered bets with casual cruelty. But the boy ignored them all. He crouched low beside the console, his fingers already moving, not with uncertainty, but with the deliberate rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times in his mind. Jalen began with the grounding array, tracing his fingertips across the corroded mount, unfastening the casing, revealing the frayed wire nestled like a forgotten root system beneath tired steel. The gesture wasn't mechanical, it was intimate, as if he were reading the factory's pulse. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone muttered that he was just lucky. But this wasn't luck. This was memory without context, muscle without ego, legacy without permission. He reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of lined paper, yellowed from use and etched with sketches, a hand-drawn circuit configuration that didn't exist in any Tucker manual. It bore the fingerprints of an engineer whose name had been scrubbed from company records, but whose knowledge now guided a boy through a maze of deliberate failure and institutional rot. Up above, on the steel balcony, Claire Monroe stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed, not out of suspicion anymore, but something close to awe. She watched his every movement, tracking not just what he did, but how he thought, each motion an extension of theory made tangible. Around her, board members muttered, not understanding what they saw, only sensing the tension building with each second that passed. 51 minutes remained. By then, Jalen had identified the first core failure, a faulty bypass, badly soldered in a rush job weeks ago. He clipped it, reseated the contact with precise alignment, and sealed the channel. His hands never shook. He moved next to the processor housing, where the heat dispersion unit was choked with a layer of carbonized dust. He cleaned it with a piece of lint-free cloth, then installed a makeshift heat sink from the bottom of his bag, something shaped by hand, bent and rebent until it fit like it belonged there. As he worked, silence overtook the room. The commentary died off. No one laughed now, not even Bryce Langford, who stood like a statue, arms folded, jaw clenched, waiting for the moment he could retake control of the room with a smirk and a cutting remark. But that moment didn't come, because the boy kept moving. 44 minutes. There was elegance in Jalen's silence. He didn't explain, didn't posture. He simply listened to the hum of power still faint in the lines, the way the metal flexed when touched, the subtle tension in a component under thermal stress. His father had once said that machines weren't problems to be solved, they were languages to be understood. And right now, Jalen was fluent. At 32 minutes, he reached the heart of the system, a logic gate loop cycling an error back into its source, creating an endless echo of dysfunction. It wasn't documented anywhere. It wouldn't have shown up in diagnostics. He found it not by chance, but by tracing the machine's breath, following the way heat pulsed through wire, the delay between commands and responses. And when he found the loop, he didn't hesitate. He rerouted the path, built a bypass, sealed it down. Every movement was as if guided by invisible hands from the past. 22 minutes left. The overhead lights flickered, subtle but real. A few gasps rose from the back of the room. Bryce shifted his weight. Claire leaned forward. Jalen stood, rolled his shoulders, and approached the control board. The press line had not yet stirred, but the air had changed. There was a hum that hadn't been there before, like the low growl of a sleeping animal just before it wakes. From somewhere behind him, the factory manager asked if he was ready. Jalen didn't answer. He just pressed the reactivation sequence, then stepped back with a calmness that felt like defiance. 10 minutes. The system began its boot up, slowly, deliberately. Sensors flickered yellow, then green. The hydraulics hissed. The feed rollers twitched once, then aligned in perfect sequence. A status bar filled on the central monitor. 100%. The feeder engaged. Hydraulics compressed. Diagnostics confirmed. The press line came alive. 0 errors. Perfect sync. 9 minutes to spare. No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence that followed was louder than any roar, because in that silence, every person in the room was forced to consider what they had just seen, and more importantly, what it meant. Claire closed her eyes for a second, taking it all in. Bryce stared at the floor, his expression unreadable. Jalen wiped his hands on his jeans, then quietly began packing his tools. He had spoken nothing for 60 minutes, but the machine had, and it said everything. By morning, the factory had become a rumor mill with conveyor belts. From the maintenance bays to the top-floor break room, whispers flitted like static. Snippets of disbelief, awe, jealousy, and something that hadn't been felt on these steel beams in years: pride. The press line was alive. Not just running, but running perfectly. Something no engineer in Tucker Steel had managed since the second upgrade cycle 5 years ago. And at the center of it all was the name that refused to stay buried: Carter. It moved through the air like electricity. People repeated it in hushed tones, unsure whether it was supposed to be forbidden or sacred. Some mentioned the boy, others mentioned the father. Most weren't sure where one ended and the other began. Bryce Langford sat behind the tinted glass of his top-floor office, the world below him humming with a truth he couldn't silence anymore. He stared at his screen, fingers idle on the keyboard. A dozen unread emails blinked red. 2 board members had requested an urgent narrative review. Public relations had asked for a quote to prepare for potential media attention. The union had scheduled a meeting to discuss implications of unauthorized trial labor. He hadn't even gotten to the part where someone leaked a video, a full hour-long capture of Jalen's repair, complete with countdown timer and synced telemetry. It had already crossed 30,000 views on a private engineering forum. Bryce clenched his jaw. He hadn't lost control in 20 years, not when the press riots happened, not when the oil crisis gutted their budget, not even when he laid off 100 people in a single day to please the board. But now, a janitor's son, with grease under his fingernails and a notebook full of ghosts, was pulling the factory out from under him. He clicked open the personnel archive. He searched for the name, Jeremiah Carter. The screen blinked once, then again. No matches found. That wasn't right. He tried again, cross-referencing the earliest machine blueprints from the original Series 4 press line. No name, no digital trace. Except one. Tucked away in a footnote on a 2007 prototype circuit map was a signature: J. Carter, R&D, temp contract. No employee file, no payroll record, just a ghost with fingerprints all over the company's most successful product. Bryce exhaled through his nose and began drafting a directive to purge archived schematics. Just a routine cleanup request, he told himself. After all, obsolete documentation cluttered the system. Downstairs, Jalen sat cross-legged on the edge of a metal pallet, elbows on his knees, watching a robot arm repeat its alignment cycle. He wasn't needed anymore. The line was fine, but no one had asked him to leave, not even the foreman, so he stayed. The space around him felt different now. People didn't ignore him like before. They kept their distance, yes, but they watched, some with respect, others with suspicion, and some with a kind of wounded reverence, as if they'd just seen the past rise up through concrete. He was used to silence, preferred it even. But the quiet around him today wasn't peaceful, it was charged. Across the line, Claire Monroe approached with a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him and looked at the machine. "I pulled the original blueprints from the off-site archive," she said, flipping the folder open. "Before Bryce could touch them, they're all signed, Jeremiah T. Carter." Jalen didn't move. Claire crouched down beside him, laying the blueprints gently on the concrete. "This design, this entire logic architecture, it came from your father. He built the heart of the line, Jalen. Not just one part, all of it." He stared at the diagrams, not as a technician, not as a student, but as a son. The ink was faded, but the shape of it, the thinking, felt familiar. The same way his own sketches had looked after hours at the kitchen table. Claire's voice softened. They erased him. Jalen nodded slowly, not in surprise, in understanding. From the shadows near the entrance, Ernie Velasquez stepped into view. His expression was hard to read, part sorrow, part vindication. He took off his cap, ran a hand through his thinning hair, and joined them. "I remember your old man," Ernie said, his voice like gravel. "Smartest guy I ever worked with. They brought him in to fix a mess that half their full-timers couldn't even diagnose. Gave him a temporary badge, no office, no credit. But he didn't care. Said the machine was the only one that needed to know his name." Claire looked up. "Why didn't anyone speak up?" Ernie sighed. "He made enemies, loud ones. There was a lab fire, electrical short. No injuries, but a lot of red ink on the safety reports. Bryce was still climbing the ladder back then. Used the accident to push Carter out. Said he was unstable, too reckless." He paused, eyes on Jalen. "They didn't just push him out. They scrubbed him clean." Jalen looked back at the blueprints. It wasn't anger that rose in him. It wasn't even sadness. It was clarity. They had taken his father's name, his work, and buried it beneath layers of corporate polish. But the machine remembered. The design lived on. And now, so did the truth. At that moment, Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and stiffened. "It's happening," she said. "Bryce just issued a statement to the board. He's denying any knowledge of your father's work. Claims you must have reverse engineered it." Jalen stood up slowly. His eyes were calm. "Let's go talk to him." The three of them, Jalen, Claire, and Ernie, walked in silence through the hallways, past departments that had spent days mocking a boy they now feared, past stations where people pretended to be busy but watched every step. When they reached the executive wing, they didn't knock. Bryce looked up from his desk as they entered. No pretense, just exhaustion behind a wall of pride. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. Jalen stepped forward and placed the original blueprint on the desk. "You knew who he was," he said, "and you erased him." Bryce's mouth tightened. "You have no proof." Ernie raised an eyebrow. "I'm proof," Claire added, "and so is the machine. It still runs on his logic, the same logic your own team failed to replicate." Bryce said nothing. Jalen didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out. The damage was done. But now the truth had a name again, and the man they erased had just stepped back into the factory, through his son. It didn't take long for the video to explode. By sunrise, it had moved beyond the confines of engineering forums. Within hours, it hit the radar of local news stations. By noon, national tech blogs and blue-collar labor sites picked it up. 14-year-old fixes multi-million-dollar press line, no engineering degree required. The headline was bait, but the footage delivered. A boy in worn-out boots, resurrecting a dead factory line with nothing more than instinct, silence, and something deeply inherited. Tucker Steelworks was no longer just a business. It was now a story, and every media outlet wanted a piece. Outside the factory gates, trucks from Channel 4 and KXRB parked side by side, with journalists huddling under tents, notebooks and cameras in hand. Reporters badgered plant workers for quotes. Drones hovered above the parking lot, catching aerial views of the warehouse where it had all happened. Inside, the atmosphere was 1 part electricity, 1 part pressure cooker. No one wanted to be the one to say the wrong thing, not now. The plant's leadership scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Bryce Langford, once the untouchable CEO with a spotless public image, had gone silent. His office door stayed shut, his name absent from every statement released by the company's PR team. Instead, Claire Monroe stepped forward. She stood in front of the press in a hard hat and safety vest, unpolished and unapologetic. She told them the truth, about the failure, about the boy, about the blueprints, and about a man named Jeremiah Carter, an uncredited engineer who had designed the very foundation of the machines that kept Tucker Steel alive. The impact was instant. Jalen's name was everywhere. So was his father's. That afternoon, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. Not behind closed doors, not buried in a memo, but right on the factory floor. Union reps stood shoulder to shoulder with engineers, floor managers, and even janitorial staff, forming a half circle around the hastily assembled podium near press line C. Claire stood beside the board chair as he delivered the statement. Effective immediately, Bryce Langford is under formal investigation for professional misconduct, document suppression, and misrepresentation of intellectual property. Until the conclusion of this inquiry, he is removed from all executive duties. Applause started slow, but quickly gathered speed. Not raucous, but righteous. As the sound faded, Claire stepped forward again. Her voice was steady, but her words carried weight. This factory was built by hands that were too often ignored. We cannot undo the past, but we can choose how we move forward. Then, without hesitation, she turned to Jalen Carter, standing off to the side, half-shadowed in the doorway. I want him to be part of the next generation that rebuilds what this company forgot. Jalen froze. The entire room turned to him. He wasn't used to the attention. His instinct was to shrink into the wall. But then, he saw his mother standing just behind the last row of workers. Regina Carter, usually quiet, now stood tall, not in defiance, but in recognition. For the first time, she didn't look like someone trying to stay invisible. She looked like someone who had finally stopped running. Jalen stepped forward, his boots heavy on the factory floor. When he reached Claire, he didn't shake her hand or smile for the cameras. He just nodded, and that was enough. That evening, Tucker Steelworks issued a formal press release confirming the formation of a revival engineering task force, a collaborative effort between senior engineers, union representatives, and new youth talent. At the top of the list, Jalen Carter. The announcement sparked both praise and panic. Praise from media outlets, workers, and tech analysts. Panic from legacy staff who had long relied on hierarchy over merit. Meanwhile, Claire worked behind the scenes to reinstate Jeremiah Carter's name to the company archives. With Ernie's help, she collected physical documentation, witness testimonies, and one surviving prototype bearing his signature. Within 48 hours, the internal review board voted unanimously. Jeremiah T. Carter would be listed as co-developer on the Series 4 press line schematic. A plaque was ordered for the main entrance, but that wasn't enough for Claire. We need something permanent, she said, something visible, something earned. So the idea of the statue was born. A bronze sculpture of Jeremiah Carter, standing not in a lab coat, but in worn jeans and a work jacket, one hand holding a blueprint, the other resting on a gear shaft. Not towering, not polished, just human, real. The statue would be placed in front of the administrative building so that every executive who walked through those doors would have to pass by the man they once tried to erase. When the news reached Regina, she sat quietly in the kitchen for a long time. Jalen had never seen her cry, not at the funeral, not when she worked 3 shifts in a row, but now she let herself feel it. Your father never wanted a statue, she said softly. He just wanted to build something that worked. Jalen replied, he did, and so had she. Days passed. Interviews came and went. A documentary crew arrived. Engineers from other states wrote in. High school students sent Jalen drawings, questions, stories about how they like to fix things too. But through it all, Jalen remained grounded. He still walked the factory floor every morning, still kept his notes tucked in his backpack, still called Ernie sir, and still wiped his boots before stepping into the electrical room. Because for Jalen, legacy wasn't about credit, it was about craft. And now, for the first time, he wasn't carrying it alone. The morning sun broke through the gray Omaha sky like a promise. Not a loud one, not dramatic, but steady, warm against the worn brick of Tucker Steelworks, casting a long beam across the parking lot, where reporters were finally gone, and workers had returned to their routines, albeit with something new in their posture: belief. Inside the plant, beneath the hum of fully operational machines, change had begun to settle into the bones of the building. Claire Monroe walked briskly across the floor with a tablet under one arm and 2 cups of black coffee in her hand. She passed 3 engineers arguing over modular upgrades to the press controls, young, sharp, none of whom would have been allowed to touch design specs just weeks earlier. But that was before the name Carter came back to life. She found Jalen in the corner of the maintenance bay, perched on an overturned crate beside Regina, who was hunched over a blueprint spread across a folding table. The lines were clean, bold, revised drawings of the outdated Series 4 unit, layered with modern modifications, enhanced thermal regulation, power distribution algorithms, fault detection redundancies. Jalen's handwriting filled the margins, but the structure, the logic, was unmistakably his father's. Claire handed them each a cup of coffee, though Jalen barely noticed. He was too focused on the printout in front of him. His finger traced a node cluster near the servo module, brow furrowed in quiet concentration. "You're redesigning it already," Claire said, impressed. "I'm fixing what never got finished," Jalen replied. There was no pride in his voice, just precision. Behind them, Ernie Velasquez wheeled over in a worn-out stool, his back popping as he sat. He squinted at the blueprint and nodded slowly. "That's clean work," he grunted. "Your old man'd be proud." Regina smiled faintly, though her eyes were misted. It had taken a while to convince her to return to her husband's workshop, just a small concrete shed behind their house, filled with dust and half-labeled boxes. The place had been locked since the day Jeremiah disappeared from the engineering world. Regina had never touched a thing, but 2 nights ago, she walked out there with Jalen in silence and unlocked the door. Inside, they found a stack of engineering journals, yellowed and warped, but legible. Blueprints pinned to the back wall, a pegboard of custom tools, and one unfinished design on the workbench, a modular upgrade for a future press line that never came to be. It was clear Jeremiah had never truly stopped working. He had simply gone underground, buried not by choice, but by force. Jalen and Regina had spent hours cataloging the material. Some pieces were scanned and uploaded into Tucker Steel's internal system. Others they kept in a private folder marked Legacy Drafts. The company wanted to name the new overhaul project after Jalen. He declined. "Call it the Carter Standard," he said. "It started before me." Now, as the plant moved forward, so did the architecture of its machines. Claire formalized the Revival Task Force into a permanent division called Reforge, a multidisciplinary team tasked with rethinking every press line from blueprint to bolt. It was diverse by design. Apprentices from vocational schools, veteran operators, young coders, retired engineers. No resumes, just a test bench, a soldering iron, and 10 minutes to prove yourself. Jalen became the unofficial center of the team, not because he demanded it, but because every decision seemed to orbit him naturally. He had a way of listening to machines that most people didn't, a way of seeing problems not as malfunctions, but as messages left unsolved. He didn't talk much during meetings, but when he did, people listened, even Claire. One afternoon, she found him diagramming a revised cooling unit for the actuator drives. She watched him for a few minutes before asking, "Do you ever get tired of fixing what someone else broke?" Jalen shrugged. "It's not about who broke it, it's about whether it still matters." She nodded slowly. That was why he was different, not because of what he could do, but because of why he did it. Meanwhile, across the administrative hall, the statue was nearly finished. The sculptor had called Claire to confirm the final touches: Jeremiah's posture, the details of his hands, the angle of the gear shaft. They'd chosen not to depict him as a corporate figure. No polished boots, no lab coat, just denim, calloused palms, and the glint of thought in his expression. The dedication would be held in 2 weeks. Workers would gather, media would return, and for the first time in company history, the founder of its core technology would be recognized, not for his paperwork, but for the fingerprints he left behind. Claire asked Jalen if he wanted to speak at the ceremony. He said no, but Regina said yes. When the day arrived, she stood at the base of the statue in a simple navy blouse and dark slacks. Her hands trembled only slightly as she stepped to the mic. "My husband," she said, "never needed applause. He never needed awards. He needed space, to think, to build, to create. And when that was taken from him, he didn't quit. He just went quiet." She glanced at the crowd, at the machines running behind them. "And now, because of our son, his voice is back. Not loud, but strong." Jalen stood at the back of the crowd, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other resting on the folded set of plans he kept with him always. Plans that were already becoming machines. Machines that would bear his father's logic, his mother's strength, and his own name, if not etched in metal, then remembered in movement. Blueprints, after all, weren't about what had already been done. They were about what could still be. 6 months after the day the machine roared back to life, Tucker Steelworks looked nothing like the factory Jalen Carter had first walked into. The lines still hummed, the gears still churned, but the culture, the soul, had shifted. No longer just a place of labor, it had become a place of purpose. And in the heart of it all stood a 14-year-old kid in steel-toe boots, quietly shaping the future without ever asking for the spotlight. The reforged division had grown from a task force into a movement. New apprentices arrived weekly, students, dropouts, dreamers, and problem solvers from across the Midwest. Vocational schools reached out, offering to partner. Private tech firms tried to recruit. But Jalen stayed rooted, choosing to build where his father had been buried by history. He led by action, not voice. He shared knowledge freely, but rarely claimed ownership. The machines he helped design bore no nameplate with his initials. But those who worked beside him knew. They felt the precision in every weld, the balance in every component, the logic that connected every wire like a quiet whisper from generations before. One morning, as the autumn chill crept through the loading bay doors, Jalen stood before a new line of machinery, the culmination of months of redesigns, failures, and breakthroughs. This was the Carter series, though no one officially called it that. Built with modular inputs, smart fault isolation, real-time diagnostic learning, and components sourced from local vendors, it wasn't just a better machine. It was a new language for American industry. When the line powered on and ran its first flawless sequence, the entire plant paused. Not because they'd been told to, but because everyone knew this moment mattered. It wasn't about a boy anymore. It was about what he had reignited. Later that day, Jalen stood in the break room, still the same worn couches and old vending machines, but now surrounded by engineers who debated solutions like equals, not rivals. Regina walked in quietly, a fresh pot of coffee in her hands. She'd long since stopped working the night shift. These days, she spoke at labor conferences and was the face of a campaign to improve protections for janitorial staff in industrial spaces. At first, she resisted the spotlight, but the world insisted on hearing her voice, and so, slowly, she gave it. And when she spoke, she didn't just talk about her son. She talked about her husband, about the hours they spent around the kitchen table sketching what he called machines for a better country. She talked about the people who scrubbed the grease off factory walls long after the engineers went home. She talked about dignity, not just in work, but in who gets remembered for it. The statue of Jeremiah Carter now stood at the main entrance, weathering its first cold front. Flowers appeared at its base every Monday, though no one ever admitted to leaving them. Some days, students came to sketch it. Other days, workers leaned against it, sipping coffee and staring up at the quiet, bronzed expression of the man who had once been invisible. One afternoon, Ernie Velasquez brought a group of interns to the statue after their orientation. He stood with his hands behind his back and told them, "This man here? He never ran a meeting, never filed a patent under his own name, never gave a TED Talk, but you see that line running behind you?" He gestured to the Carter series, humming like a heartbeat. "That's his voice. That's his story." Back inside, Jalen walked the floor with a clipboard, checking the coolant levels on a new prototype. Claire joined him near the robotics control panel. She leaned against the rail and said, "You've done more in 6 months than this company managed in a decade." Jalen didn't respond. He adjusted the feedback sensors and took a note. Claire smiled. "Still not taking compliments?" Jalen shrugged. "Just making sure it works." She nodded, knowing better than to press, but there was one thing left undone. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded letter, an offer from the National Institute for Applied Engineering, full scholarship, custom-built mentorship program, lab access, the works. She handed it to him. "You don't have to answer now," she said, "but the world's bigger than this factory, and it's waiting for someone like you." Jalen looked at the envelope, then at the machines around him. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just said, "Let me finish this first." Because for Jalen Carter, destiny wasn't something handed to you. It wasn't about fame or fortune or even recognition. It was about what you leave running when you're gone. And here, amid steel dust and sparks, he had found something worth keeping alive.